Hi, I'm Jessica Henze. I'm Senior Book Conservator here at NEDCC.
What are the tools generally used by book conservators?
Well, book conservators use a wide array of tools, but most of the work we do is actually done with simple hand tools. And so I brought a bunch of things here today to talk about. Most of these tools would look very familiar to people, including, bookbinders of old would look at these tools and know exactly what everything was about. And likewise, if I were to go back in time to a bookbindery of, say, 400 years ago or something, they would have tools like these and I would understand what I was looking at there as well. A lot of the tools that bookbinders use are actually not really specific to our field. They're things that are used in all kinds of fields, including things like measuring and cutting tools, nice straight edge, square for making things precise and square and neat, which we always aim for even though it's not always possible. Triangles for the same purpose, nice pair of dividers that you use to transfer measurements or to divide up things into even increments, and then scissors, which are used for exactly what you would think scissors would be used for, mostly cutting paper, but sometimes other materials, cloth and leather and so forth. Cutting tools. My favorite everyday knife is actually just a snap-off blade Olfa knife. It's my go-to thing, but we also sometimes use scalpels of different shapes and sizes when a particular shaped blade is needed, or you need something that's very, very sharp, or you know that you're going to destroy it and want a blade that's disposable. And then everyday tools like tweezers and little tiny awl, pin vise. There's another very recognizable tool. You might wonder what we would use a hammer for in taking care of old and rare books. That seems like a bad idea, but actually this is what's known as a backing hammer, and a cobbler would recognize this as also being a cobbler's hammer, essentially. And what we use this for is actually a very subtle and precise kind of work, which you wouldn't think you would really do with a hammer. But you know how books have that nice, not all books, but some books have that nice rounded shape on the spine. That's created by hitting it with a hammer in a very particular way. And we would only do that to reestablish that shape on books that had already been made that way. We would not do that to a book that was not already made that way. Some of the other things I have here, needle and thread. Very often in book conservation we need to re-sew a book that where the sewing has failed. And I think sometimes that when we say we're going to re-sew a book, that people imagine a sewing machine or some kind of heavy equipment like you would find in a commercial bindery that makes books like you would buy in a bookstore. But in book conservation and traditional hand book binding, everything is done by hand with a needle, either straight or curved, big or small, and linen thread of various weights, depending on what's called for. And let's see, what else do we have? Brushes. Again, brushes, totally familiar. Every conservation lab of every sort probably has brushes. But in book conservation, there are three main types of brushes that we use. We have brushes for glue, brushes for paste, and brushes for toning. And the way that I keep this straight in my mind, so I don't use the wrong brush for the wrong material, is that glue, which in this case is usually a synthetic glue like PVA, we would use a plastic handled brush with synthetic bristles, and small ones for fine work, large ones for large work. We would typically only use PVA on new material. For example, if we're making a new binding, a new cloth case binding for a book, we would use a big brush like this with PVA, but generally speaking, we keep that kind of adhesive away from the original material. When we need adhesive on the original materials, we would use paste, most typically, and these are paste brushes. This small one is what I would use if I were doing paper repair, so a small brush for mending, and then this large, flat Japanese brush with the nice, probably badger bristles, I'm not sure, but I think maybe badger. That you would use when you're lining larger pieces with Japanese tissue. And then this configuration of brush is for pasting out leather when you're doing a new leather binding or a leather reback on a leather book. And then for toning, by toning I mean coloring the repair materials that we're using. Usually that would mean Japanese paper or linen or potentially cotton. So when you're coloring the material before you apply it to an object, you might use a large brush like this, or maybe something smaller, but something large for toning large pieces of material. And then when you want to do touch-up of repairs that are already on the object, we use little tiny brushes like this to do the fine work of in-painting and touch-up. So those are all the really familiar tools. Now we get to the ones that are more specific to bookbinding and book conservation. And I've got 3 sets of things out here. First one here are folders, bone folders, we would typically call them, although they're not always made of bone. I have 2 here that are traditional bone folders. This is my sort of everyday favorite shape. And then this one is a different shape. Bone is nice because it can be modified, so I modified this one to a shape that I like better for when I'm making boxes and doing that kind of work. Another common material for bone folders, it's weird to call it that, but this is actually Teflon, so we would call this, I suppose, a Teflon folder. Teflon is really nice because it's very slick and slippery and doesn't burnish the objects, but it has the disadvantage that you cannot modify the shape of this. It's not safe to sand or heat Teflon, so you sort of work with what you've got with the Teflon folder. And then this third one, this one is actually made of Bakelite, which is one of the earliest commercially produced plastics. And this one I use for one very specific task. I use that when I'm making cloth book bindings, cloth-covered book bindings. And let's see, this next set of tools, these are spatulas. 2 of them are what we would call a Caselli spatula, and they're made of really nice steel, and they're slightly flexible, which is useful. And the nice thing about them being steel is that you can sharpen them and they will hold a very nice edge. These are sort of indispensable tools. They get used for all kinds of things, like lifting paper and leather on a binding when you need to be able to get underneath it to insert new material, cleaning off the spines of text blocks when you're trying to get all the old adhesive off, all kinds of things. Even just lifting up things that are fragile when it's too hard to pick it up with your hands, we would use something very thin and flexible like that. And then this third one is a similar idea, but it is stainless steel. Doesn't hold as nice an edge, but you can use that one in water without it getting rusty, which is an advantage. And then this last set of things are leather paring knives. And bookbinders sweat over their leather paring knives because these need to be extremely sharp to be effective. And so I think all of us know maybe more than we want to about sharpening our tools from trying to get our leather paring knives in good enough shape to do the job the way they should. So I've got 3 different knives here. They're all really designed to do exactly the same thing, but the interesting thing about these is these 3 different types of knives are from 3 different parts of Europe. This style is from 3 different places. This one, which is the one that I first learned to use, is a French paring knife. It's got a curved blade and a wooden handle. And then the one in the middle here is what's typically referred to as a Swiss style paring knife. And it again has the curved blade, but it just has leather wrapped around the metal shank and no separate handle. And then this third one is what's typically known as an English paring knife with a straight blade, and I didn't even wrap the handle on this because when I use this type of knife, I am often working on things that already have paste on them or are wet, and so I want to be able to clean this knife easily when I'm done with it. So these are the knives that we would use to prepare a piece of leather for doing a leather reback on a book or doing a new leather binding. And that's my basic toolkit. There are other things that I use, but these are the ones that are absolutely essential. And any bookbinder or book conservator probably has a similar set of tools like this. They'll have some variations, some things they like that I don't use, and some things that I use that they don't have any use for. But every book conservator has something that looks very similar to this to get the work done on the books.